Now at this stage I also want to make another introduction of another person who's just joined Politics in the Pub. This is Kaye.
So I'll be filming Politics in the Pub each week now, and it will be uploaded to the Politics in the Pub YouTube channel, and in the second phase everything will be embedded directly onto the website politicsinthepub.org.au. All right?
Okay, thank you very much. Isn't that wonderful? It's a dream we on the committee have had for years of how do we extend these wonderful programs to beyond these walls, and finally it's being realised, and we are just so excited about. I'm sure you can see you will also be excited at what this is now going to bring you, and of course your friends and family who can't get here for a particular night. So thank you. Now Q&A.
First of all, I want to compliment both John and Rose on a very, very difficult topic to talk about, and you handled it very well. Both of you did well. This stupid Australian people, and I mean all of us here, allowed, and this is the Labour Party, allowed poles and wires to be included in the cost. Operating costs. That really is capital costs. That should not have been included in there. They included in. That's why you and I are paying these huge prices. So I would want to hope, looking at you, Rose, that you make that point across to our dumb Labour politicians who don't understand finance, and they don't. Vertical fiscal imbalance. And what that is that the federal government takes in 60% of all the money that goes to the three levels of government, state, federal, and local. However, it only spends 40%. On the other hand, the state government and the local government spend 60%, but they only take in 37%, 1/3. That's the problem. Why is this being allowed to happen? And here's the other question, you got to address this. The finance people, like Mike Baird's finance, they think that debt is bad. It's not bad, as John has said, but somehow it's bad for governments, but it's not bad for business. You work it out. Please answer that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for the two speeches. Rose, you have religiously asked us to vote again back Labour Party. We have seen the last 10 or so years your crony Bob Carr and Kristen Kennelly and all that. What have they done for us? Why can we then again vote the same old mob back?
My name's Janet Burstle. I'm a member of the New South Wales Public Service Association, and we've come along tonight because obviously the issue is close to what we're dealing with. I have to say, John, that I agree with practically everything you say, and what I really look forward to is when the left and the Labour Party will openly express the same criticisms you point to from what Labour governments have been doing. I am a member of the Labour Party, by the way. But the question I really want to ask you is what you would do about the vested interests that push privatisation, particularly in TAFE. It all started with just a little bit of innocent funding to private adult community education, and has grown into the lobby group that we saw Tony Abbott in the arms of, the Australian Council of Private Education and Training, and the White House School of Design that kindly gave his daughter that lovely scholarship.
I think you've asked your question.
Okay, so particularly, would you see increasing public ownership? What would you advocate, not just stopping privatisation of? What public ownership would you advocate, and do you see a role for advocating public ownership of banks and finance as a way to undermine this lobby group and this financialisation and consumerisation of society instead of us being citizens as you've advocated, John?
To Joe's questions first, I'll take them in the order we got them. To Joe's questions on the issue of poles and wires, and what Joe is saying is, because they're a natural monopoly, the way you pay for them is they go to the regulator, the Australian Energy Regulator, that's part of the ACCC, and they say, we want to spend $16 billion over the next 5 years on new wires and new poles. And then the Australian regulator says, yes, that's okay, you can do that. And then that gets passed through in your bill and you have no choice but to pay for that. That's the problem with natural monopolies. The weak link in that chain was the Australian Energy Regulator, who in 2009 approved massive amounts of expenditure on wires and poles to build an old-fashioned, very good but old-fashioned network that went from power stations to households. Instead of saying, no, you can't spend that amount of money, you should instead invest in energy efficiency, making people use less energy for the same outcome. You should invest in strategic demand management, switching things off when the network was under stress. Instead of doing that, they went for the old-fashioned solutions. In terms of vertical fiscal imbalance, if I had it's not just the 40-60 problem, that the Commonwealth collects 60% of the revenue, but the state spends 60% of the costs. Instead of, it's not just that it's 40-60, it's also that the Commonwealth has all the growth funds. They have the income tax funds, they have it's effectively the sales tax, the goods and services tax. What we have in the state, the biggest single tax revenue we collect is transfer duties. So if the market goes cold, we lose huge amounts of money. We only make money in the state when there's a property boom on. You don't really want to pay teachers only when there is a property boom on. I think we need to rewrite the Federation. I am not a centrist or a centralist. I believe in the states. I think they have an important role to play. But I think we can't go on the way we're going. It creates this problem. But the key thing I want to say is debt. Debt has become a four-letter word in state politics, and it should not be. You know, people get very excited about these measures of debt like net debt. In fact, the Sydney Morning Herald gave the wrong definition for net debt. It's the amount of money that the state owes minus the amount of financial resources they have, their holdings and so on, the amount of money people owe them. It's a meaningless measure. It's an absolutely meaningless measure. You know, 3 years ago, my net debt was close to $500,000 because I purchased a house. It doesn't make sense. It simply does not make sense to talk about. I was quite wealthy because I had a house. I owed a lot of money on it. We need to talk about debt by taking into account the things we're spending it on. It's okay to borrow money. It's good to be in debt if you're spending that money on things that are going to make you wealthier. If we spend money on better schools better public schools for our kids, that's going to make us wealthier. If we borrow money to spend on better railway system, that's going to make us better. The thing we should be focusing on is not how much of it is debt and how much of it is what we get from selling other things, but what are we going to look like in 10 years' time? And privatisation, you know, like the privatisation is kind of the opposite of debt, and when you look at it backwards from the future, it makes us poorer in the future. To the issue, it says here, Rose, Labor. I knew that already. Not much difference. Oh, yes, the gentleman up here. Not much difference between Labor and Liberal. That's our fault. We let Labor get away with it. What we've got to do, all of us, is get really tough on Labor. We've got to demand more from Labor. You know, Rose talked about wanting to be here with the Robertson government, talking about, you know, what was your expression? It was great. Whatever it was. That will only happen. John Robertson is not going to do that unless we demand it. John Robertson said the word TAFE. I was thrilled. In his budget reply, he said the word TAFE. That only happened because TAFE teachers got really, really feisty with Labor. All of us, and the PSA, everywhere. We have to get onto Labor's case and make sure they do the right thing. The last thing is, are there things I would take back into public ownership? Absolutely. I would begin with banks aren't in my bailiwick. It's somebody with a much higher pay rate than me in federal politics does banks. But what is in my pay rate, absolutely, is electricity retailers. I would renationalise the electricity retailers. I would renationalise the power stations. I have to say, I would, in terms of TAFE...
After they go broke.
Yeah, and get it for a good price, get a good deal.
In UK they had to.
But I would also, with respect to TAFE, I would freeze the amount of money going to private providers back at its 2010 level. I would do the same with schools, back at their private schools at their 2003 level. I would not let any new private provider get access to public funds unless they can prove to me that TAFE cannot do the task for which they are being funded. TAFE has to be the first in, last out. Public schools have to be the first in, last out. Public hospitals have to be the first in, last out. We cannot allow our public services to be residualised. I must say also, I think that there is a strong argument about the privatisation of the TAB and whether we should look at, if not getting it back into public hands, at least regulating in a way that we get more money out of it. It's incredibly destructive. We should at least get some benefit from it so as we can feed that back into serving people who are caught with gambling addiction problems.
Now, Rose.
Yeah, I'll just briefly address some of those. I agree with John's comments about the challenges around vertical fiscal imbalance, and I would suggest this could actually be a very interesting topic for an entire politics in the pub, because of course it's now additionally confused and sort of the water's been muddied again with the recent High Court decision around school chaplains, which of course was a fantastic decision in that policy should never have been funded by the federal government. However, there are some real risks for progressives in what the court actually said in that judgment around things that we would like to see the government funding and like to see the federal government funding. And some programs that I think progressives would actually hold very dear are in fact now potentially brought into the orbit of challenge by our enemies because of the legal consequences of that decision. So this whole area of which government collects the money and which government spends it and what they can spend it on is incredibly challenging. And whether you support a kind of more fundamental rewriting of our federation, of the constitution, or at least of our legal frameworks, I think that's a very interesting question and might be one that standalone politics in the pub could actually look at. I also think that we need to consider debt financing. I'm more than happy, and as I said, some of us within Labor have been pushing Labor to be much more active and aggressive around what we consider as funded under debt financing. And one of the reasons that I think this is so important, and it's sort of something that John touched on, is this issue of risk shift. So taking on a debt is always a risk. You're always taking a little bit of a risk when you take on a debt. But who do we believe as progressives should take on that debt? And I don't believe it should be individuals. I think it should be the state. I think the state is in a much better position to take on debt and service debt and manage debt than individuals. And what we do through privatisation, cost cutting, deregulation, that whole sort of policy gamut, is we shift risk onto individuals so that they have to pay increasingly for housing and for education and for health and for electricity and all those things, and individuals are in a much worse position to manage the risk associated with debt than the state. And so that's why I think there is actually a really important role for debt financing by the government, because they're much better at much more able to manage that risk. To the chap that said, why should you vote the same old mob back? I would never ask you to do that. I am not here saying vote the same old mob back. It is my position that Labor is no longer the same old mob. There has plenty of work that we still need to do. I completely accept that. Plenty of work we still need to do. But if I honestly believed that we hadn't made any progress or made any changes since we received the sort of drubbing that we probably deserved in 2011, I wouldn't be here today. I'm happy to have that conversation with any one of you about the things that the party has actually done to address that. First and foremost, expelling most of those people whose names are thrown up. They are no longer in the Labor Party, and if they were in the Labor Party, I wouldn't be in the Labor Party. But they're not. We got rid of them. Now, there are still problems. Again, I'm in the left. I'm challenging Labor. I take that role very seriously. But no one in the Labor Party is asking anyone in the community to vote the same old mob back in. We are a completely different party than we were, and we've taken reforming ourselves in the face of that defeat extremely seriously. And I don't believe that there's no difference between Labor and Liberal. I actually agree with John that, all governments, Labor, Liberal, potential Greens governments, require an incredibly active civil society and grassroots movement to hold them true to their values. That is a necessary part of a vibrant democracy, an active grassroots civil society. So I actually agree that's really important. There is a difference between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, and if you need evidence of that, look at what Tony Abbott is doing. Labor had a lot of dysfunction in the last federal government. I think we all know that with the leadership challenges, but still pursuing an agenda that had a lot of things that I think as progressives and as a Labor Party member, I'm very proud of. And Tony Abbott is dismantling all of that and going further in his destructive attacks on the things that we hold dear. And I think you have to look at that, and you cannot argue there is no difference between Labor and Liberal. In terms of the last question, a couple of points I'd make. How do we stop vested interests that push privatisation? One of the things that I think is really important is to look at implementing most, if not all, of the ICAC recommendations around lobbyists. So this is, publishing diaries of everyone that ministers meet with, being much more robust in terms of the lobbyist register, which is actually pretty weak at the moment, really strengthening that. There is actually a lot we can do, and ICAC, I love ICAC too, ICAC have made some very clear and very important recommendations around how to try and stop political corruption in New South Wales, and I think that a lot of them are really worth pursuing if we want to try and push back on some of these vested interests that are pushing a privatisation agenda. I'm not sure that I would necessarily support increased public ownership of banks and finance. I'd probably support more state support and promotion of things like Members Equity Bank, credit unions, mutuals, cooperatives. I think they play a really important role in our banking and finance system, and that's something I'd probably start there and prioritise focusing on that. Definitely the big four and the banking system needs a lot more competition, and I think that mutuals and cooperatives can play a really important role there. One thing, just that I thought of that I probably would bring back in-house and really make a government service again is employment services. So the privatisation of employment services I think has been very bad for unemployed people, and I think that is just becoming more and more obvious. We're seeing evidence, increasing evidence now that those private providers, often not necessarily private companies. This is, a lot of the time it's a not-for-profit sector, but they have an active financial incentive to get people into training and just kind of cycling them through this stuff as opposed to really helping them find meaningful jobs, and that is not what we want in that sector. So I would bring, as just one that I can think of, employment services back in-house and have the government run them, because I think that is the best way to really invest properly in long-term unemployed people finding jobs.
As John pointed out, this virus of neoliberalism goes back 30, 35 years. And actually, I would make a point. One of the worst decisions that was ever made was by the Hawke Keating government to privatise the Commonwealth Bank. Look what's happening now with the Commonwealth Bank. We need to follow Ross Gittins from the Herald. This election should be a referendum on privatisation. We need to turn the tables on Baird, who's going to sell off these poles and wires in order to fund private roads and private rail. That is what it's all about. West Connex and the North West Rail Link, both private things and anti-environmental projects. I think we've got to launch a huge campaign from now, a people power campaign to focus on these issues. It's environmental and people power. So, comment please.
Ben Hills has just published a book about the downfall of Fairfax. I heard him interviewed the other day, and you were both talking about how much you thank God for ICAC, and I really don't think that we would have had much of particularly the investigation into the corrupt behaviour of some Labor politicians if it wasn't for the investigative journalism of the Herald. Now what I'm getting to is that he said in the interview I heard the other day that within 3 years he doesn't think that the Sydney Morning Herald will actually stop publishing a daily paper, and that's how dire their financial situation is. So my question is, I find that profoundly disturbing for our democracy, and I'd like your comments on that. Because the alternative, we all know, is Murdoch.
My question is, have either of the speakers given any thought to, say, some revenue-raising measures in relation to infrastructure, such as betterment taxes, which exist in Europe? And the nature of betterment tax is that the concept is if the state spends money on, say, a fast rail link or on an extensive metro system, we know that the properties near those stations and so on increase in value, and so the increase in value, in fairness, isn't attributable to any effort by the owners, and and some states have had betterment taxes to help fund that sort of infrastructure development, and that is an area where actually state governments do have an opportunity to raise revenue.
I'll try and keep my response brief. I mean, in relation to the question around investigative journalism, I mean, I actually completely agree. One of the one of the issues with privatisation, I think there is that context between public is open and private is closed. And that's something that sort of John mentioned, that when we privatise things, we take not only, you know, all of the attendant problems with that, but we actually take it out of the public sphere where we can shine the light on it, whether it be through, you know, FOI or calls for documents, whether it be through, you know, parliamentary committees, things that the, you know, programs that the government administers are open to public accountability, whereas private programs don't have that kind of scrutiny. So the scrutiny of the media is incredibly important. I mean, I think it's a huge challenge. Both my parents are journalists and sort of bemoan constantly, regularly, all the time, the decline in investigative journalism in this country and the challenges that, you know, companies like Fairfax face. We're also, you know, seeing cuts to the ABC, cuts to SBS. This is something that I think we should all be extremely concerned about. I don't really have a good answer other than please keep buying the Herald daily and get all your friends to as well, or, you know, make sure that you subscribe online, you know, and become a digital subscriber, because really, you know, that's the only way, you know, continue sort of patronage of those organisations, that we're going to continue to support them. But I completely agree, this is something we have to grapple with. And on the betterment taxes, yes, that is something that we're looking at. And in fact, recently I was at a forum hosted by the McKell Institute, which is a Labor think tank, that was talking about that very issue. So, you know, I think that New South Wales Labor is probably still quite a long way from adopting that into our policy platform. But I certainly feel as though those are exactly the types of issue, and that one specifically, that are on the agenda being promoted by thinkers within Labor and think tanks within Labor for New South Wales Labor to look at.
Isn't it interesting how Conservative politicians love to say the age of entitlement is over, and their little asterisk, and down the bottom of the asterisk is except for landowners who still have entitlement. You know, the tax giveaways to people who own capital are enormous, and one of the worst examples is people who buy land, speculatively buy land near what's going to be a future infrastructure development, and then get it upzoned and sell it. And obviously, I totally agree with that. It's essential that we start collecting some of that. But there's also a more complex issue, politically very complex issue, of land taxes in general. And I think we need to have a robust debate. Well, every debate about land tax is always robust, in my experience. But we need to have another one of those debates, because the reality is that land keeps increasing in value massively. And we don't, as a society, we don't capture any of that value at all. Not just because of infrastructure, but just because of population growth. So I think there's a real reason for doing that. Did I dream it? Was I having a nightmare this morning? Or is Janet Elbrickson now in charge of appointing people to the ABC's board? I want to go home. That is awful. It's really, really terrible, and we can't let that happen. I look at the ABC and the SBS, and I look at what is going to be probably another 2 years, if not another 5 years, of ongoing assault onto those. I look at the profound mismanagement of the Sydney Morning Herald. The Sydney Morning Herald has been massacred by its management. It has some of the best journalists in the world. Really, Kate McClimate, Sean Nichols, there's a bunch of them out there, Anna Patty, there's a whole bunch of them out there who do really, really world-class journalism, and every single time they get knifed by a management that simply can't make money. They just don't know how to do it. And I go back to the guy who put the rot in there, which is Fred Hilmer, father of competition policy and father of the death of the Sydney Morning Herald, because he thought, oh, we'll just go online and make a lot of money there and it'll all be good. You know, we need better management at the Sydney Morning Herald. I totally agree with you, Virginia. It's a really serious issue.
Okay, now.
Hi, my name's Danielle. I'm a Central Councillor at the Public Service Association. My question is for Rose. What is the ALP position in relation to privatisation of disability services in New South Wales? Will you reverse the coalition policy and keep disability services in the public sector? And if you're not able to comment on the party's position, what is your personal commitment?
My name's Kaye Spees. The issue I want to raise is Crown land. 42% of the state is Crown land. People may not realise that. The state government is carrying out a review of Crown land management, and they want to flog a lot of it off. Some of it they want to transfer to local councils into freehold, but there is the opportunity there for it to be changed from what's called community land to operational land, and then they can sell it. Great opportunity for huge real estate gains there, and that land can just become high-rise havens for the wealthy. Would you like to comment about that review, please?
I had to give a speech this week on corruption, and I looked at the history of corruption in New South Wales, and the biggest corruption scandal the state has seen was in 1903 around the issue of leases over Crown lands. And it brought down a government, first of all brought down a lands minister, then it brought down a premier, then it brought down an entire government. It is absolutely true that wherever you have privatisation of public land, you have people moving in for the kill on that land. I'm very concerned about the review of Crown land. I totally agree with you. My colleague David Shoebridge is working very seriously to try and expose the risks that we're at with this review of Crown land. There's not a local government councillor of the progressive stripe around New South Wales who's not very concerned about it.
In relation to the Labor Party's position on the privatisation of disability services, so I'm not able to comment in a whole heap of detail, although I'd be happy to get your contact details and provide some additional information offline. I certainly know a few things. I certainly know this issue was the source of considerable contention, questioning, investigation within the Labor caucus in New South Wales. I certainly know that they had a range of meetings with a whole heap of interested stakeholders about where to land on this. In the end, as you would know, Labor supported the NDIS enabling legislation that the Liberal government moved. And I know that that is because it was their assessment that overall, the implementation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme in New South Wales was a pressing priority and something that they absolutely had to support, considering it's a flagship policy for Labor. But I certainly acknowledge that they did that, recognising the specific concerns around where home care was going to end up. But yes, as you know, they ended up supporting the enabling legislation. I don't believe it's Labor's position to reverse that if they get into government, although I'm not entirely clear that we've finalised our position on that, because we do have our annual conference in a few weeks, and there hasn't been an annual conference since that decision was made, and we make our policy democratically through annual conference. So I don't actually think that Labor as a party has even had a chance to consider that issue in detail. And yeah, I'd be interested to get some more feedback on that I can hopefully feed into that decision-making process. My personal position, in fact, United Voice, the union that I worked for, represents some home care workers in the private sector, and so I'm well aware of the extreme challenges that those people face, with those not-for-profit providers. So my personal position, it is preferable for those people to work for the government, to work for the state, and for those services to be provided by the government. I've seen how difficult life is for people who work in home care, who work presently outside of the government, so I wouldn't want to put more people in that position.
Can I just comment very briefly on that? I got into a whole mess of trouble because I spoke out against the bill. And an awful lot of people in the disability sector, largely in the private sector or non-government sector and disabilities, who were very angry at me for doing so. There were 4 or 5 of us in the New South Wales Parliament, from recollection, who did speak out against it. There was myself and my colleague David Shoebridge. There was Sonia Hornery and Linda Volz and Shiket Mossaman. The last 3, of course, are from Labor. It was a difficult task because the reality is we need more money for people with disabilities, and we need better ways of delivering it. Our argument, the 5 of us were arguing, the best way to reform disabilities is to maintain disability services, is to maintain a very strong public sector presence, which can drive change in a way that probably the private sector and the non-government sector would not be able to do so. I must say, if it were up to me and I was suddenly the Premier of New South Wales, one of the things I would do is put the brakes on and stop and reverse the privatisation of disability care. I think there are massive problems associated with this.
In the UK, they privatised trains, and they privatised water, and they privatised a whole lot of things. And And within about 10 years, these utilities were being returned to the government because they were completely worn out. There had been absolutely no input into them, and they were returned in a degenerate state. Is the government prepared for this?
The other night I was invited to a Liberal Party party, and I thought, gee, that's good, I won't have to cook for tonight. So I went along there and they were talking about the privatisation of roads. Now, I went home and looked up when roads were private in England back in the 12th and 13th century. Now, let's look at it. We have these roads that we have to pay on now to go on. You know, is this the thin end of the wedge? Are we going back to the 12th and 13th century?
John, you made a statement that the SDA union was the only exception among the unions, except for public sector unions, to be weakening. You know, you said you would tell us why later. So,
Okay, I'll talk about this.
Okay, that's fine.
The issue of dilapidated assets being returned to the public sector is a major problem. Some of the privatisations going on are leases. For example, I think the wires and poles has been spoken about as a lease. The ports are a lease. The ports are a 99-year lease. Who knows what they'll look like in 99 years' time, but it's not just when they're handed back, it's what they look like throughout their life, because in public ownership there is a sense of, well, we need to look after these assets and make sure that they are handed from one generation to the next. The private sector tends to have a reporting cycle to the next prospectus or the next annual general meeting of their shareholders. So they have a much shorter horizon. When we're talking about infrastructure assets, you really want people to have a long-term view of those. To the issue of private roads, well, the M2 was built by the Greiner government, that's privately owned. The Eastern Distributor was built by Labor, that's privately owned, that's basically owned by Macquarie Bank. Private roads, unfortunately, are not new. What terrifies me, I'm less concerned about roads, I'm really concerned about the privatisation of rail. And you know, we're getting this ridiculous system in New South Wales. We're going to have trains that are single deck and trains that are double deck, and we're going to have the northwest tunnels bored so they can only take single deck trains. Now, why would you do that? Why would you do that? Well, basically you want to bust the RTBU, the Rail, Tram and Bus Union, and that's basically our money is being used to bust a union, bust a public sector union, so you put private sector operators in and a private sector set of trains in there. It's even worse than that. We own the trains and they operate them. Same with the ferries. You and I own the ferries, but they're operated by a private company. We have in my opinion, we have very little control over what that's going to look like. I think it's a really bad interface where it was exactly like Labor's Gem Trader model, which was incredibly unstable, where we owned the expensive assets, but they owned the output. We've got to stop doing that. We've got to put the whole lot into public hands. Bruce, I think my comment about the SDA was it was the only union that was not in the public sector that was still fairly buoyant in its numbers. And I think the reason for that is simply the nature of the workforce. They have a workforce that is not declining as rapidly as, for example, a manufacturing workforce is. I was making probably rude remarks about implied rude remarks about the leadership of the SDA, and I have been on record saying this, and I'll say it again, I find it extraordinary that the union leadership of a union that represents shopkeepers, many of whom are young and many of whom are gay, has such appalling attitudes on issues such as women's rights, abortion, same-sex marriage, and the rights of lesbian, gay, intersex and transgender people. I do find that bizarre, and I do find that troubling at times. That was the implied remark that I was making.
I don't have much more to add. I mean, on yours question of is the government prepared for that? I mean, I don't think they are. I don't think this government is. I think the answer to your question is no. And I think the reason for that is they, as John has alluded to, they are completely obsessed with short-term thinking, making money, cash splashing in the short term. The challenge for us, as it is in another area of critical importance, climate change, is to draw the links with the community, with the Australian people about that long-term perspective, about the challenges that you're, very, very rightly, pointing out, as happened in the UK. People in Australia need to know that that is on the cards here as well, and we need to paint that long-term picture for them because the government is not prepared for it at all. Oh, and I would say, on the unions question, just a plug for my old union United Voice, who is experiencing massive growth in the early childhood education sector.
Okay.
Part of that union because of the real push to properly professionalise early childhood education in Australia, which has nothing to do with the topic, but it's a good news story for unions.
Lovely positive thing to end on. Yeah.
Just in line.
Well, I think we'd all agree that we've had an amazing night. Two wonderful speakers giving us an analysis at real depth and yet with very specific examples. I think they both have been wonderful, and I'm not going to withdraw from what I said earlier. It was a unity ticket. You can see what actually does unite on a fundamental level both of the political parties, both of the progressive parties, and I hope we see more of this being united together in really exposing this dreadful, dreadful way in which neoliberalism is basically about social engineering. So do so show your appreciation by acclamation.